March 7th, 1945, Remagen, Germany. The sky shook with artillery, the Rhine Valley drowning in smoke and fire. Columns of retreating German soldiers jammed the roads, trucks stalling, horses collapsing in the mud, officers screaming for order that no longer existed. On the cliffs of erupted Ludendorff, anti-aircraft guns barked furiously, their tracers carving red arcs across the gray sky. Beneath them, engineers crawled over the Ludendorff Bridge, wiring charges to steel beams, preparing to erase the last intact span across the Rhine before the Americans could touch it. Into this chaos pushed the 9th Armored Division. Dust-caked Pershing tanks rumbled forward through shattered villages, infantry riding their hulls, weapons ready. Scouts peered through the mist and froze. There it was. Against all logic, the Ludendorff still stood, the only bridge left across Germany's ancient barrier. At headquarters, the order was short and savage. If it lives, take it. Time was already running out. Reports warned the bridge would be blown at 4 p.m. That gave the Americans less than an hour. For Lieutenant Karl Timmermann and his men, it meant charging straight into machine gun fire, onto a structure rigged with explosives, with no guarantee it wouldn't erupt beneath their boots. The race for the Rhine had begun. This is the story of the first Allied crossing of the Rhine in World War II, a collision of courage, luck, and seconds. For 10 days, a battered bridge will become the most fought-over piece of steel in Europe. And at the center, an American lieutenant born in Frankfurt, a handful of tankers and infantrymen with fixed bayonets, and a mother in Nebraska who only wants to hear one thing. He's alive. The bridge stands. The Rhine is no longer a wall. The Rhine River. For centuries, this broad, fast, unforgiving current had been Germany's moat, its natural wall against invasion. Armies from Napoleon to the Kaiser had learned that without a bridge, the Rhine was nearly impossible to cross. At Remagen, the river surged cold and brown, 1,000 feet wide, its current pulling hard enough to swallow boats whole. Sheer cliffs rose from its eastern bank, 600 feet of stone and forest looming over the water like fortress walls. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had dismissed this sector as hopeless for a crossing. Eisenhower's planners wanted Montgomery farther north, where the terrain opened into plains better suited for tanks. Remagen was written off. Too steep, too narrow, too well defended. The manuals agreed. Only a fool would attempt it here. Yet the Rhine had to be crossed. The Ruhr's factories lay just beyond the industrial heart, pumping steel and weapons into Hitler's crumbling armies. The Allies had built the means, treadway bridges, landing craft, entire schools devoted to river crossings, but nothing compared to finding an intact bridge. If such a prize existed, it would shortcut months of grinding preparation. On March 7th, the unthinkable appeared before American eyes, the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. March 7th, 1945. German High Command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had warned that the Rhine was only as strong as its bridges. Blow them, and the river became an impenetrable wall. Leave even one standing, and the Allies would pour through like water through a crack in stone. His orders were clear. Every bridge must be destroyed before the Americans arrive. But at Remagen, General Gustav von Zengen saw danger that others dismissed. The Rheinbach Valley to the west formed a natural funnel, guiding U.S. armor straight toward the Ludendorff Bridge. The Americans would be stupid not to use it, he warned. Yet his pleas for reinforcements were ignored. Field Marshal Walter Model insisted the main blow would come at Bonn. He stripped Remagen of men and tanks, leaving only engineers, convalescents, and scattered flak crews to guard the crossing. On the bridge itself, sappers wired Donnerite explosives to steel beams. Detonator circuits ran into the tunnel beneath erupted Ludendorff. The plan was simple: let as many Germans retreat east as possible, then blow the span sky high. To the Nazi High Command, Remagen was just another point on the map. To Zengen, it was the weak seam in Germany's armor, and the Americans were closing fast. March 7th, 1945. Noon outside Remagen. The roar of engines shook the hills as Brigadier General William Hoge's Combat Command B pushed forward. M26 Pershings, fresh to the front and bristling with long 90mm guns, rumbled down the narrow roads, their treads grinding over rubble. Behind them marched Lieutenant Karl Timmermann's company, a 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, moving fast through the shattered woods. Through the mist, scouts raised binoculars and froze. The impossible stood before them. The Ludendorff Bridge was still intact. German trucks and troops streamed across it in chaos, retreating east. Wooden planks had been thrown over the tracks, turning the span into a lifeline. At headquarters, a captured German prisoner delivered chilling news. The bridge was wired for demolition, scheduled to blow at 4 p.m. The message reached Hogue like a gunshot. He relayed the order to his officers: "You've got 45 minutes to take the bridge." The tanks rolled into firing position, blasting a locomotive on the far bank. German sappers detonated charges under the western ramp, tearing a crater into the roadway, but the steel span still stood. Smoke and debris filled the air as Timmermann shouted to his men, "Fix bayonets! Move!" The race for the Ludendorff had begun. At 3:15 p.m. on the east bank of the Rhine, German engineers hunched over the firing switch inside the Erpeler Lay tunnel. Major Hans Scheller, newly arrived to command, hesitated. His orders were to blow the Ludendorff Bridge, but only after the last of his retreating men crossed. Still, the Americans were already in the town. Machine gun fire cracked from the towers, tracers slashed across the span, and the thunder of tanks echoed from the west. Time was gone. Scheller gave the signal. The switch slammed down. A deafening roar split the air as explosions tore through the bridge. Smoke and debris shot skyward, timbers ripped from the deck, and for a moment it seemed the massive span had lifted off its piers. Then silence. The Ludendorff still stood. The main charges had failed. On the western bank, Lieutenant Hugh Mott and 2 engineers sprinted onto the bridge with Timmermann's assault troops. Bullets snapped around them as they hacked at demolition cables. Sergeant Eugene Dorland fired his carbine into a live wire, severing it in sparks. Others tore charges loose and hurled them into the river. German riflemen fought from the far towers, but the engineers kept cutting, racing against a second blast. The bridge, by sheer luck and courage, refused to die. At 3:30 p.m., smoke drifted over the Rhine as Lieutenant Karl Timmermann gave the order, "Go." His infantry surged forward, crouching low, rifles ready, racing onto a bridge alive with gunfire. German machine guns rattled from the stone towers, bullets punching into the wooden planks. Mortar shells splashed into the river, sending geysers of water sky high. The bridge groaned under the weight of tanks, trucks, and fleeing German troops trying to reach the far bank. Sergeant Alex Drabick, a wiry Ohio farm boy, sprinted ahead of everyone, bayonet fixed his boots hammering the timbers. He was the first American soldier to set foot on the east bank of the Rhine. Behind him, others fanned out, firing into the tunnel, entrances, and the cliffs above. On the span itself, chaos reigned. Engineers ripped explosives from steel girders, tossing them into the river, while Pershings and Shermans fired across the riverbank, hammering German positions. A locomotive burned on the tracks, black smoke choking the crossing. Yet still, the Americans advanced. By 4 p.m., Timmermann's men had established a foothold on the far side. The impossible had happened. The U.S. Army had crossed the Rhine alive, and Hitler's impenetrable wall had been breached. News of Remagen reached Hitler within hours, and his reaction was volcanic. The Rhine, his sacred barrier, had been crossed by the enemy alive. He raged that commanders should be court-martialed, that engineers had failed in cowardice, that the Wehrmacht itself had disgraced Germany. Orders were screamed from Berlin, the bridge must be destroyed at any cost. Within a day, German artillery batteries were dragged into position, unleashing a storm of shells onto the crossing. The span shook and shuddered under direct hits, steel beams twisting but refusing to fall. Engineers patched holes with planks and steel plates, working under fire, sometimes tossing sandbags into the gaps to keep vehicles moving. Then came the Luftwaffe. Waves of Me-262 jets, Arado bombers, and Stukas dove at the span, dropping heavy bombs, rockets, and even experimental guided missiles. Each time, American anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts, cutting down attackers. Still, several bombs slammed into the bridge, tearing sections apart but never enough to drop the whole structure. For 9 days, Remagen became a battlefield unto itself. Infantry clung to the east bank, engineers fought to keep the bridge alive, and German fury rained down from sky and hill. Yet the span endured. For 10 brutal days, the Ludendorff Bridge held against everything Germany could throw at it. Artillery shells slammed into its steel frame, bombs cratered its approaches, and divers even attempted to float explosives against its piers. The Luftwaffe hurled wave after wave of fighters and bombers, including jet-powered Me-262s, but American anti-aircraft fire turned the skies into a storm of black flak. Engineers worked without rest, bolting steel plates, laying timbers, and even using bulldozers to shove damaged sections back into place. The bridge became more than a crossing, it was a symbol of Allied defiance. On March 17th at 3 p.m., the battered span finally gave way. With a groan like thunder, the central section sagged, twisted, and collapsed into the Rhine below, sending a spray of water and twisted steel skyward. Dozens of engineers were thrown into the river, some never resurfacing. For a moment, it seemed the miracle had ended. But the bridge had already served its purpose. In just 10 days, over 25,000 troops, 2,500 vehicles, and tanks had surged across, establishing a massive bridgehead on the east bank. Pontoon bridges now spanned the river in multiple places. The Rhine was no longer Germany's shield, it was the Allies' highway into the heart of the Reich. The fight for the Ludendorff Bridge was more than a tactical victory, it was a psychological earthquake. To the German people, the Rhine had always been a sacred frontier, a line that no enemy army was meant to cross. When American infantry stormed across under fire and tanks rumbled onto the east bank, that myth was shattered forever. Hitler's fury only deepened the despair as he ordered officers executed for cowardice and raged that the impossible had happened on his watch. For the Allies, Remagen became a symbol of momentum. Newspapers at home hailed it as the bridge that shortened the war. Soldiers who had bled their way across France and Belgium saw it as proof that the end was in sight. Within weeks, Eisenhower's armies had fanned out across Germany, their advance no longer choked by rivers and bottlenecks. Karl Timmermann, the young lieutenant who had led the charge, received the Distinguished Service Cross. Sergeant Alex Drabick, the first man across, became a hero remembered long after the battle, yet both men insisted the real credit belonged to the engineers and infantry who kept the bridge alive under fire. At Remagen, courage, chance, and timing aligned. A single bridge changed the course of the war.